Hi everyone, I'm Scott Helme. I am a security researcher, founder of some free tools online like Report URI, security headers, and I also do training on TLS and PKI, which is part of what I'm here to talk about today. So I'm going to be talking about shrinking certificates, and I'm referring to HTTPS certificates or SSL certificates, however we refer to them, but the certificates that we purchase and use to give us this really important symbol that we all know in our browsers. Now, of course, I'm referring to the purse icon or the handbag icon if you're from Europe like me. And this is the connection security indicator in the browser. But we have seen in the past that there is a large amount of confusion around this. For example, if I go to the Apple website right now, we can see the iPhone 14 Pro, which I have on order here with the security indicator. And if I zoom in the top right here, of course, you can see the connection security indicator or perhaps the shopping basket icon. But of course, I'm actually talking about the connection security indicator, which means that we are using TLS to give us the S in HTTPS. This is how we get the padlock icon in the address bar. Now, when we use TLS to protect our communications online in order to give us secure communications, we actually get three different things. And many people only ever think about the first one, really, which is the confidentiality of our communications. If I am going to send some information across the internet, across this public network, and I'm using TLS, I have a secure connection with HTTPS, then other people cannot read my emails. They cannot see what websites I'm visiting. They cannot see any sensitive information that I may type in because the communications are confidential. TLS gives us confidentiality. But it also gives us two more things that are just as important. And the second one here is authenticity. If I want to go to Venafi.com and I'm going to purchase something, type in my credit card details, I need to know, am I actually speaking to Venafi.com? Am I speaking to who I think I am speaking to? So TLS gives us this assurance. It gives us the assurance of authenticity. We are speaking to the correct party. And the final thing is integrity. If I receive an email or I load a news article from a news website, am I reading what the other person wrote? Has it been changed? Has it been tampered with in some way? Did something get added or removed? So with the assurance of integrity, I can know that if I am reading a news article, it is what the news outlet wrote and it hasn't been changed by anybody. Now, focusing on certificates provide one of the very specific components within these three. Certificates provide the authenticity component. This is how we know that we are speaking to the right party, because the certificate allows us to be sure of their identity. Now, certificates themselves, in essence, are very, very simple and haven't really changed a lot in the now decades that we have been using them. If you inspect any certificate online, if you're going to a website in a browser or communicating with some kind of API from a device, you will see that we are using a X.509 version 3 certificate. So X.509 being the standard that governs them, and version 3 being the current version that we're on. Now, X.509 v3 came out in 1996, which means that the bulk of the structure of a certificate has not changed since then. So we've been using the same certificates, and it always kind of reminds me of this meme from Lord of the Rings. And it's a bit like when they stood there and Elrond saying, I was there, Gandalf, 3,000 years ago at the beginning of time. And it feels a little bit like that with certificates, because if you think about when we were using certificates and version 3 came out in 1996 and what the internet and the web looks like and what they look like now, when we're still using exactly the same certificates, things have changed a lot. But certificates haven't changed at all. Certificates still have all of these same fields present. Now, as much as they do have the same fields present, we can see here things like the not before or not after date, which is the start date of a certificate and the expiration date of a certificate. The restrictions around the content of these fields has changed a little bit. So the start date is obviously a timestamp in UTC, and the end date is obviously a timestamp in UTC. But there have been tighter restrictions around the gap that is allowed between these 2 days, how long the certificate can be valid for. And if we roll back the clock far enough, we can see certificates that were not only valid for several years, but certificates were allowed to be valid for many, many years. And of course, based on the title of the talk, we're talking about this shrinking certificate lifespan that has become shorter and shorter and shorter as time has gone by. Now, if we roll back the clock just to 2012, this was the first real restriction on the lifetime of certificates that was introduced, and certificates were capped at 5 years in validity. So you could request that a certificate was issued for your domain, and the difference between the start date and the end date could be 60 months, absolute maximum. So you could have a 5-year certificate. Prior to this, certificates were generally much longer, and this was the first real restriction that was introduced. Now, 5 years back then, I guess this is a pretty lengthy certificate, but it was better to have some restriction than no restriction. And this was the beginning of the shortening of certificates, because as we continue to roll the clock forwards now, if we look in 2015, you can see here that certificates were reduced down to approximately 3 years in validity instead. Now, from here on out, you'll see that for every 1 year of validity period, you also get an additional month of validity, just so that we can have some administrative overlap, so that you can conduct things like renewal processes and still maintain your renewal anniversary. So we say a 3-year certificate. As you can see, it's obviously 39 months. So for every 1 year, you get that extra 1 month of validity. Fast forward to March 2018. And we saw the next reduction in the limit on certificates' lifetimes. We saw certificates reduced down to 825 days, which is, again, approximately 2 years and 2 months. So this was a real kind of breaking point for certificates, in my view, where 2 years seemed to be the tolerance point for most organizations that were consuming and using certificates. And there was a lot of resistance to try and continue the push of reducing the lifetime of certificates beyond this point. However, after kind of being pushed through by a large client device vendor in the ecosystem, we did eventually get certificates down to what I refer to as a 1-year certificate. And again, as you can see, it's approximately 1 year and 1 month in order for you to have those administrative overlap periods. But these are now what I would refer to as 1-year certificates. And this is quite a significant shortening from where they used to be, especially, if we just roll back 1 decade prior to that and look at like 2010, and you could have comfortably had certificates much longer than 5 years. Now, the biggest resistance to the shortening of the lifespan over time has always come from the overhead of having to renew them. Certificate renewal processes require people to do tasks. And, as people, we're generally unreliable at remembering to do the tasks. And then when we do the task, if we remember, we are generally unreliable at doing the task well. So there has been a huge drive towards the automation of certificate renewal in order for organizations and for the industry to be able to better tolerate this reduction in certificate lifetime, which creates an increase in the workload for certificate management. If I was to plot this on a graph and we look at the validity period of a certificate over time, you can see obviously that the graph line is only going to go in one direction over time. Certificates continue to get shorter and shorter as time goes by. And there haven't been any indications from the industry that we are at the final destination in the journey of reducing certificate lifetimes. And I believe, and the industry indicates, if you look closely, that we are going to continue to see reductions in validity period. Now, a really good reason that we need shorter and shorter certificates is that we as people, we make mistakes. We may have a compromise or a breach in our servers, in our environment. And an attacker can steal from us the private key associated with the certificate. Now, the certificate is designed to prove our identity. I have a certificate on my website, and it proves that when you go to my domain, you are talking to a server that is behind my domain and nobody else. Now, if an attacker steals the key from me and they somehow come into possession of the key, they can present my certificate, and this attacker can also prove that they are me. So now we have a scenario where somebody who is not you can prove that they are you. And the whole concept of authentication at this point is completely broken, because now you actually can't be sure of who you are speaking to. Now, we have historically had mechanisms to try and deal with this issue. Revocation, for those familiar with the topic, we've had certificate revocation lists, or CRLs, in the past. We moved to OCSP, the Online Certificate Status Protocol. And both of these mechanisms have had their fair share of issues and currently largely don't work within the Internet PKI. So effectively, we don't really have any reliable revocation mechanisms. So in this scenario, when an attacker somehow compromises your key and is using your certificate to impersonate you, the only thing that will stop them from using the certificate is that the certificate expires while they're using it. So they will continue to use it until the certificate's expiration date. Now, of course, if we think about that in the context of reducing certificates' lifetimes, the shorter the certificate becomes, the less opportunity an attacker has to use it to do bad things, to impersonate us, to steal our customers' information, intercept and decrypt traffic to our site. So by reducing the certificate's lifetime, we are hugely reducing the scope that an attacker has. Now, given that revocation does not work, and given that CRL and OCSP are both gone, it really is the case that shorter certificates are the only option. And many people have said, well, given now the explosion of encryption online and so many websites, services, devices, so many things use these certificates, can we bring back one of these two revocation mechanisms? And they both work in relatively simple ways. You as a site operator send a revocation request to the CA. A certificate revocation list is a list of serial numbers of certificates that are revoked, maintained by the CA. So you would send this request to the CA. They would place a serial number on the revocation list. OCSP responders work in a slightly different way, in that you simply query the OCSP responder with the serial number of the certificate and say, is it revoked, yes or no? And there have been many efforts within the industry to bring either one of these mechanisms back, or perhaps find a suitable alternative, at which we currently don't have one at the present time. But revocation lists, CRLs, and OCSP are both definitely no longer viable. The biggest problem with revocation lists, and this is quite easy to explain, is that they just became too big over time. If you have a list of serial numbers that's been revoked, over time, the list gets bigger and bigger and bigger. If a client wants to look up a serial number on the list, it needs to download the list. So as we make the list bigger and bigger and bigger, the file that the client has to download gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So now, if you were to look at some certificate revocation lists for large certificate authorities, the client would quite comfortably have to download a file that was tens of megabytes in size in order to look for a serial number on the list, because the list is simply that large. So revocation lists in this form became a really non-scalable solution a long time ago. And OCSP seems like a much more lightweight protocol. You send the serial number to the responder and say, is this revoked, yes or no? And the responder can tell you that it is or is not revoked. The only problem with this, and the reason that OCSP fell from grace so kind of quickly, is that if you're asking for the status of a certificate, then you're giving away which website you're going to. Because if you go to a particular website and then you ask the certificate authority, hey, is the certificate for this website revoked? The only reason that you want to know if the certificate is revoked is because you're trying to go to the website. So now the certificate authority knows something about you. And this is an enormous privacy leak. And certainly in today's modern web, this is really not something that people would tolerate. So given the size issues of revocation lists, the performance and privacy issues of both of these, OCSP also fell from grace. Now, these are two of probably the most prominent reasons that we need shorter certificates. But when I say shorter certificates, I'm not actually just referring to the end entity certificate or the server certificate or the HTTPS certificate, as you may refer to it. When I say we need shorter certificates, we can actually take that and apply that more broadly to all certificates within the certificate chain. Because of course, if we have a client connecting to a server and we're doing certificates for authentication, there are really going to be a minimum of 3 certificates in that chain if we're talking about internet PKI. So the end entity certificate, the one that we as server operators control and renew ourselves, yes, they have become shorter and shorter over time. But we are now also seeing wider efforts within the industry to shorten not only the lifespan of the end entity certificates, of the server certificates, but also for the CA certificates in the chain as well. Now, a particular focus more recently coming out of Mozilla is around the root certificates. We have a really interesting problem that's brewing online right now, in that typically root certificates are allowed to be valid for 20 to 25 years. And most certificate authorities, the big, large commercial, and the more legacy CAs, the ones that have been around for a long time, were founded and created in the late 90s and the early 2000s, which is approximately 20 to 25 years ago from the present day. So we're now coming towards, within the industry, the first real foray into having root certificates expire, widespread, publicly trusted root CAs. And we have several of them coming towards their expiration dates in the coming years. So Mozilla are currently going through a process of proposing that we should start to introduce restrictions on the maximum validity period of root CAs as well. Now, this issue has manifested itself in quite a few different ways. And one of them that I can talk about from my own experience is around smart devices. Now, here in the UK, we have the BBC, our national television broadcaster, and they stream a lot of media to smart televisions. Smart televisions get manufactured. They're essentially, a small computing device, and they have a root store built into them in order for them to do secure comms. If they want to communicate with the BBC iPlayer API, which is their streaming media API, or if you want to connect to other streaming services, we need to be able to do authentication with the service. So you might need your Netflix password or your BBC password. These devices have to be able to do secure comms. For that, they need to have a root store. And they have a root store. They're built in with a set of root CAs. Now, unfortunately, I can't really remember the last time that I went downstairs and thought, it's time to update my smart television to make sure it has the latest updates. And I'm sure there are many other people out there, just like me, that don't really kind of sit down and regularly update their television. And what this means is that the device is frozen in time. Its root store is static. It's not receiving the new root certificates to replace the root certificates inside it that are expiring. Because just like our service certificates that expire and have to be replaced every year, root certificates also expire and have to be replaced. They have a slightly longer validity period than 1 year, like our certificates, but they are still certificates that expire and have to be replaced. But if the television isn't being updated, or whatever the device is, if the client device is not being updated, it's not going to get those new root certificates to replace the ones that are expiring. Now, that means that once the root certificates in the trust store expire, it can't do secure comms anymore because it has no trusted root CAs that it can build a certificate chain down to. Now, we have already seen a couple of large root CAs, a couple of notable root CAs expire, and they did cause issues. They did cause ripples within the ecosystem. So this isn't a theoretical issue. We are going to see more of these kinds of problems in the ecosystem as more of the major root CAs continue to expire over the period of next year and the following year. So it's not just about having shorter certificates for the end entity for the service certificate, or, as I've just mentioned, for the root certificate. We also have to consider the intermediate certificate as well, because just like we've seen reductions in lifetime for the end entity and for the root, we're also continuing to see a reduction in lifetime for the intermediate, because the intermediate, for any certificate that you obtain, the intermediate should be considered and treated just as dynamic as the end entity. Theoretically, the CA could change their intermediate at any time. And if you don't send an intermediate, as we see here on the slide, or you send the wrong intermediate, or perhaps you've treated the intermediate as static in your configuration, which I do see sometimes, and you continue to send the incorrect intermediate after its expiration, all of these things will cause the secure connection to potentially fail, and probably with a really good likelihood of it failing. All of these issues that I've talked about so far come back to a lack of agility within the ecosystem. And one thing that we do need within this ecosystem is more agility. And as much as many people were really, really excited about the introduction of Let's Encrypt in 2015 and 16, as much as many people were really excited about the fact that Let's Encrypt was giving away free certificates, and many people quite rightly saw that as the most exciting thing about Let's Encrypt, the thing that I thought was kind of most important about what Let's Encrypt did, and I remember talking to some of their founding members about this, they were very, very specific about the reason that they chose to only issue 90-day certificates. Because back when Let's Encrypt started, you could have much longer than a 90-day certificate. You could still get certificates with a validity period that allowed more than 1 year, multiple years. But they said, no, we're only going to issue certificates that are valid for 90 days. And the reason that they did that was because they sat down and they said, look, nobody is going to reasonably try and use our API for the issuance of certificates. And the idea is you renew them every 30 days. So it's a 90-day certificate with a 30-day renewal cadence. Nobody's going to sit down and try and do that manually because it's too aggressive, it's too frequent. And the overhead of doing that would be too much. But everybody still wanted free certificates. So they created a demand for something that we didn't have, which was really widespread support for reliable automation of certificate issuance and management. And they even spearheaded the standardization of a protocol for that called ACME. Now, the Acme protocol isn't currently that widely supported throughout the CA ecosystem, but the first problem that we had when Let's Encrypt was originally launched was not that we didn't have a CA that supported Acme, because Let's Encrypt supported Acme. We didn't have support in the client environments. We didn't have good tooling in a variety of platforms like we do now. So they created the demand for it. Nowadays, if we take a look at this ecosystem, you can, no matter what platform you're on, I could probably throw a rock and hit 5 good Acme clients for your platform of choice. So there is now a really broad selection of very effective and very reliable Acme clients. So you can do automated certificate renewal and issuance. If we are going to continue to reduce the lifespan of certificates, we need to continue to improve our agility within this ecosystem. So for the most part, it resides on server operators, obviously, to be concerned around the end entity. Tools like Acme automatically take care of provisioning the certificate bundles. So when you obtain a new server certificate, you automatically are provided with the correct intermediate bundle. So we no longer have to worry about making any mistakes there, or making an error that will have a negative impact on the connection security, ultimately giving the client a bad experience. So we need to continue to drive forwards with shorter certificates. But when I say shorter certificates, again, like I mentioned, we have to remember this isn't just the end entity certificate. This isn't just the server certificate. We need to consider the intermediate certificate. Yes, I think this is a much easier problem for us to get past, because the intermediate certificate is never going to be more dynamic than the end entities that reside on it. And given that they are provisioned together, I think actually any shortening in the intermediates will come relatively easily. I think the next big problem out of the 2 big problems that we have is around the root certificates validity period. As we come to shorten those, I think the lack of agility in the client ecosystem is much worse than within the server environments out there. So we do need to continue to push forwards. We do need to continue to reduce the lifespan of the end entities, and I hope that that continues. And we do need to continue to reduce the lifespan of the roots. Once we have the level of agility required, once we have widespread automation, and once we've resolved these issues, there's no reason then that we can't continue to plummet the lifetime of certificates. Once we've got over the hurdle of automation, certificate lifespans almost become irrelevant. So I think the main goal for the industry should be to get to some level of automation on the clients, to get to some level of being able to update the root store. Now, we already see this with Windows 10. They've broken the root store update mechanism out of Windows Update. So if you want to update the root store on a Windows 10 device like the one I'm sat at right now, I don't need to do a Windows Update to do that. It's been separated out. So I have a really high level of agility in the maintenance of the root store on this device. But not everything is a really modern device running Windows 10. So we still have a really long way to go. But now, effectively, for me on this device, it wouldn't matter how frequently the root store changes. So once we can get over that hurdle, once we can give ourselves that little bit of agility, we can solve most of the problems that we're going to come across in the next few years.